Hello and welcome to this week's devlog for my procedurally generated voxel RPG game. This is a game about exploration in a procedurally generated fantasy world where you collect items, fight monsters, and discover things. Last week, after much arduous exertion, I managed to finish off the technical rework that I had planned back for many weeks, and was very pleased to see it finally shot in the back of the head. So as a result of my newfound freedom, I decided that I would prefer to get back to working on the gameplay features of the game. Imagine that, working on gameplay in a game development setting. But mere moments in, I suffered the sudden realization that I had no idea what I actually wanted to work on. And I realized that the time had come for me to do that thing that I had never done before. Write a game design document. Doing this, I would be able to plan out the next few months, while also consolidating all the information about what I'm doing at the moment into one single place that is easily consumable to the general audience here on YouTube. I only had a week, and I spent most of Monday recovering from the last week anyway, but I was going to write myself a juicy document. There would be words and stuff in it. So the purpose of a game design document is to lay out the plan for the game in a format that someone like, say, a publisher or a member of the team could very easily understand. So, given the nature of this project, it was pretty obvious to me that I needed to have some sort of living document which got updated as the game progressed as well. Clearly then, the best approach was to version the document in Git and use the world's greatest document editing system, the final form of the A4 piece of paper, LaTeX. And that is actually how you say it, by the way. It's basically a programming language for documents. I'm not even joking. You essentially just write your code in plain text, and then you can compile it out to one of the various output formats, like PDF in my case. With that decided, I had a hunt through GitHub for some pre-made game design document LaTeX templates, and eventually ended up finding this one. It looked like a formal document really, so I basically just had to fill it in with my stuff. So then, here is my game design document. I'll pitch it to you like you're an actual game publisher, so prepare yourself. So I decided to start the document off with this initial sentence: explore a procedurally generated world collecting items, fighting monsters, and discovering places. Intends to distill the feeling of exploring a large fantasy world into a tight gameplay loop, riddled with dopamine and quick, flashy content. It's meant to be fun above all else. I mean, it's a game after all, and I just think that's what they're supposed to be. So one trick I use is this method of trying to use 3 words to encapsulate everything that the game is supposed to represent. So in this game, the 3 words I ended up choosing were quick, flashy, and lots. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you might have come across that, but at the start of this year, when I had a completely different plan for what this game would actually look like, when I came to redesign it, I was able to use those 3 words, which were the same as what they were before, to kind of continue in spirit of what I imagined I wanted to make. It's only 3 words, so it's very easy to keep them in your head at all times, especially for someone like me who is constantly operating on minimal brain capacity. And just to read out the overview of what I expect from those things: gameplay should be easily accessible and fit into short play sessions. Animations, gameplay, and interactions should fit into a small amount of time to keep the player engaged. During gameplay, something should happen every 5 seconds minimum. The player is expected to make snap decisions regarding their health, stats, collected items, and other things. As far as flashy is concerned, animations should be fast and eye-catching. The interface should emulate the feeling of using a slot machine. That's sort of important to me. It should be well animated and a source of dopamine. When the player achieves something important, the interface should respond accordingly and provide congratulatory feedback. The art style should be fun and engaging. So in the early version of this game, it was more of like a user interface thing. I've moved away from that. It's more of like a 3D interactive thing, but I still think the interface should be flashy, entertaining, desirable to look at. I mean, it's a mobile game fundamentally, like you can't have it be boring. Finally, lots is really just talking about the variety of items I expect to have in the world, so there should be lots of variety in items, monsters, and things to discover. New items are gradually introduced to the player as the game plays out. A variety of reward systems should make the game appealing, and there should be lots of ways to utilize these items in ways that affect the gameplay. Basically, there has to be lots and lots and lots of stuff, because it's a game about exploring and finding things. It would make 0 sense if I only had 5 items on repeat and I just flipped the skin of them. That's boring. So the next thing I talk about is how the gameplay actually plays out moment to moment. Now, one of the things you've got to remember is that the main bit of this game is about the exploration itself. So let's just talk about how that works. So essentially it follows this loop of begin your exploration, find items, places, kill monsters, and collect resources. You then eventually, when you're done with your exploration, you reach the gateway, end the exploration, and then you have options to increase your level with the EXP you found, trade items, progress the story, and you essentially just repeat that until you have finished the game. So it's a bit like a roguelike in that sort of sense, where you often have the gameplay loop and then you have like the home base bit in the middle. I think that should help progress the story, and also it's quite convenient for an indie dev because it's just straightforward. There's not so much complexity you have to get involved with, so that's quite nice. So fundamentally, this game is about grinding and leveling. I don't necessarily see those things as a bad thing. I think they can actually be quite fun. I just think you have to do it right. Like, if the moment to moment in the game isn't fun, then the grinding isn't fun. But if that is fun, then, I mean, everyone loves to grind. What can I say? So I go into quite a lot of detail here about how the exploration actually plays out. So just to give you a quick overview, essentially the player is presented with a freshly generated world and you move around it, you find stuff, and if you run out of health, then you die, you lose all your stuff, and you don't progress. The game is about taking risks, so there's risk and reward. You know, if you want to keep going into the darker parts of the world and you know, make difficult choices or whatever, then you can do that, but it's all up to the player. So the input of how the player moves around the world was something I spent a bit of time considering. Of course, it has to work across keyboard and mouse, controller, as well as touchscreen. The touchscreen is the important one because that's sort of the black sheep of the family. One of the things I do mention in this section is that part of the gameplay is actually navigating the camera around the scene. So you can use the camera orbiting method to actually see the sort of stuff that's off in the distance, and I intend to make it so that the camera orbiting is actually a part of the gameplay. So being able to see where certain things are off in the distance should be part of the day-to-day activities of the player as they're playing it. So combat is fairly simple. It plays a bit out like something like RuneScape, where you just sort of tap an enemy and then the character walks towards it and begins the combat. The enemies do a similar thing, like if they see you then they'll target you and walk towards you, and that's just sort of how that works. I intend for the combat not to be like too in your face necessarily. It's more part of the micromanaging aspect of the gameplay. So you're moving around, obviously it's not that micromanaged, but it's also not just like you don't have to pay massive attention, you don't have to be hammering buttons in order to do the combat. It's a combination of you checking what your character's doing while also deciding where to go in the world next. I think that is the sort of loop I'm looking for. So visiting places, there's a little bit of a caveat at the end of this because I haven't quite figured out how that's going to work necessarily. The plan originally was that you'd be able to just find a place in the world and go to it immediately, so that would be like a separate scene. I've already got all the technical work that's done for that, but I need to make sure it doesn't break the flow of the exploration. Like, that is important. So you can't have it like the player goes off to a town and then gets loads of items that then make the exploration boring and take away any of the risk from it. So some of the other concepts I do have is things like the procedural dungeons. They're, procedural dungeons are just generated for you. They give you a bit of an extra challenge if you want it, and then you obviously get some reward at the end if you're successful. So that would still work because it's all part of the exploration. In terms of visiting places, I don't know. I think I'll have to think that one through, but there's potential. Technically, it's all in place. So terrain types really just talk specifically about how when the player is moving around the world, they should respond in different ways. So for instance, when they're going over the water, they're obviously going to move slower, and there might be some gameplay considerations to take into account as a result of that. Similarly, I could have systems like where if the player goes uphill, then they go a bit slower. This is really just there to try and get the player to think a bit more about what they're actually doing, the decisions they're making. So rather than just saying you can climb up this mountain without any regard for the actual reality of the fact that your player has to climb a mountain, I think it would be quite interesting if it was a case of, walking along a flat land is fine, but then going up a gradient, you maybe move a bit slower, and then of course going down the gradient, you go a little bit faster. I think these things will help give the player more of a perspective of how the gameplay actually works, and gives the impression that the world is more realistic than maybe it would otherwise. I talk a little bit about dropped items. I think that's a fairly understandable concept. It's essentially that if your player or character walks over something like EXP orbs or some money or some items that are on the ground, they'll just collect them. But I do talk a bit about how things like EXP and money you can have limitless amount of, but certain items you have an inventory system that you're again going to have to manage, so you can't necessarily keep hold of everything. But I want to make it simple. I don't want to have it so you have to click on the items or anything like that. It has to be straightforward, and of course that would then translate better to mobile, so that's important to me. Now, some of the more interesting things, the biomes. So technically, again, I have that in place for biomes, but I have big plans for what I'm going to be doing in biomes in the future. I essentially want to have all sorts of wacky stuff for biomes. Like I can just absolutely let my mind go wild about all sorts of things. It's like, you know that like Mushroom Island biome that used to be in Minecraft? Like that would be the tip of the iceberg for what I can imagine. I'll have all sorts of things. I'm looking to make just a load of wacky stuff because of course you need that in a game like this. It's about variety. It's about discovering things. You have to have that twang of, oh wow, I've just discovered something that's really quite unique. And I think you could have a system where, like, you know, the goblins that spawn in the cherry blossom biomes are all pink or something like that, because that would just help sell the effect. It's interesting, and it wouldn't be too much to do from a technical perspective. So that's definitely the plan, and what I would also really like to do is integrate that with a bit of the lore, so actually explain what a lot of these things are doing there and how they work and why they're the way they are. That should be really fun. So here's something I haven't really spoken about before. It's the idea that I would be masking certain bits of the world, so making certain bits of the land actually invisible. At the moment you can see literally everything in the world. And now of course if I'm going to work towards a future where you would actually have more variety and the more things that are unique in the world, then I would like to make it so that you can't actually see certain things. You don't necessarily know what's over the horizon because the world hasn't particularly unveiled itself to you. You actually have to walk through certain bits for the world to start making itself visible. Now, I think that could be a really, really interesting gameplay element, because what it also adds is the risk of, you know, maybe the player ends up in a biome that they don't necessarily like. I mean, some of the biomes might be like really helpful. You know, you might get biomes where there's lots of fruit that give you health or something like that. And then you might get biomes that are just riddled with monsters and generally horrible. I would like to have that sort of variety in the world, and I think it would just be so cool to have that sort of thing. And importantly, make it so that you have to make sort of snap decisions about whether you're going to keep going or not. And I would also like to try to make some hints about what the player can actually expect to find in certain bits of the world. So I think the example I use is something like Breath of the Wild, where you can often see off in the distance, you know, you've got a tower and you can see, you know, oh, that's a tower that's in the volcano, or that's a tower that's in that other bit, like the desert. You can sort of make decisions about that, but you can't necessarily see it on your map. So I think I'd maybe like to try and do the inverse of that in a way where you can't actually see what's going on in your map, but you can maybe see some sort of hint, you know, like a hint beacon. So that would be pointing out like, okay, this part of the world, there's guaranteed to be a settlement here. So there's something for you to find here, but I can't tell you if it's good or bad, and I can't tell you what it is, can't tell you what type of biome it is. But you can see, you know, maybe I'll have like a shimmering effect where the invisible bits of the world is meant to be. And you can see these beacons or whatever that are indicating to you that there's stuff there. So with that, you can kind of make a decision about what you think the world looks like, and you can use your best judgment to decide which bits you want to go to first. But then, of course, it also adds that risk and reward aspect of you don't know what you're going to find, you just know you're going to find something. And I think that's really compelling. The next thing I touch on is distractions. So I'd like to have a whole kind of plethora of distraction systems that are in the world. Again, in the concept of a game like Breath of the Wild or just any open world exploration game, what's more fun is knowing like I'm trying to get to that tower over there, but along the way I find a bunch of interesting stuff that kind of threw me for a loop. And now I'm in this other side of the world because I just kept following that stuff. That's really fun. That's what keeps you engaged. It's that thing where you have lots of stuff going on at once. That is what makes these sorts of games fun. So I've kind of listed a few of the different ideas of what I think could be used to distract the player and keep them on their toes. So random encounters. The 50-50 chance thing, that's kind of an interesting idea that I'd like to prototype, which is like you go to a certain part of the world and the user interface tells you like, okay, if you go to this bit, you're either going to get 100 gold coins or you're going to get an encounter with some enemies. You don't know which one it's going to be, so do you either take the risk or not? And of course it could be more than 50, you could split the probability, that sort of thing. It's really just to give the player an option. Items which trigger a chain of EXP orbs. Of course the world's going to be smaller than Breath of the Wild, but it's things like, you know, you go towards an item and it does, you know, like in Mario you used to get those music note things and you have to follow them. Kind of like that. And like other things, I think I'm going to come up with a whole load of ideas of things I can use to distract people, but it's things like just chests, like findable items, interesting things you see off in the distance, that sort of thing. Another system that I haven't really spoken about before that I've been contemplating for a while and generally think would add quite a lot to the game is a weather system. The weather system also includes the day-night cycle, but that's not really mentioned here. For weather specifically, I imagine it would play out a bit like how it worked in Pokemon, where it's like it happens in the overworld, but it also has an effect in the battle scene. So it's things like certain enemies would spawn when it's raining, or certain items would spawn when it's raining, or certain combat moves would be less effective when it rains, that sort of thing. And as well as weather, like rain, there's also like thunderstorms. But I could come up with all sorts of interesting things that I don't know. It's literally anything. It's a fantasy game. On top of that, the day-night cycle is a possibility. I think it kind of affects, again, similarly what type of things spawn or that sort of thing. It maybe will be in the nice to have section. I don't think it's too much of a priority, so I don't actually mention it in this document, but it is something I've been contemplating. So let me know in the comments if you think that would be fun. So another gameplay aspect I mentioned here is exploration indicators. This is kind of like a blanket term for things which tell you a bit about what you can expect to find in the exploration. They're sort of there to guide the player along the way and just essentially help the player read the world that they see in front of them. So in that perspective, I'm thinking very much things like paths along the world, maybe signposts that you can walk up to and get some information from. It would tell you things like you can expect to find this place in this direction, or generally there'll be signs of life in this direction or something like that. And maybe you can tell a bit from the paths, like what sort of thing you can expect. This was a bit inspired from Don't Starve, which is another procedural game. They have this interesting system where you can see paths along the floor, and as you get closer to where the pig people live, the paths start to become sort of tiled, and you can see, signs of life. It's meant to be something that you can read from, even without playing the game. I think you can understand that if you're running through the land and you find suddenly a tiled path, that's obviously signs of life. So one of the final things to talk about, and I think this is one of my best ideas that I've had in many, many years, is the pre-exploration buffs system. So let me just explain why this needs to exist and then explain what it is. So a problem I have currently in the world is that it takes about somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 8 seconds to generate a single world. Now, of course, this system becomes less efficient as the worlds get bigger. It takes longer to generate a world. That's to be expected. Currently, I generate worlds 400 by 400 size. The problem with that is probably realistically the smallest size I could possibly do for a game like this. It probably needs to be bigger. So I can't guarantee that it's not going to take a long time to generate a world. So that presents me with a problem because the game has to be quick, right? That's one of the rules. So the player clicks explore, they should be thrown into some sort of gameplay thing that will have some bearing on the exploration. So what I've decided to do is kind of bake that waiting time into a bit of a workaround in the form of the pre-exploration buffs. So the purpose of the buffs is that they're just things that you collect. It's things like you will get 1.5 times coins in this exploration, guaranteed. You're less likely to find monsters. You're more likely to find individual places. The idea is that those are buffs, so they operate on a per exploration basis, and they're not like you can't keep hold of them or anything like that. So what I'm thinking is, specific to the buffs, I need to have some sort of mini game that can be played before the exploration begins. Now this has to be very low on CPU intensity, because really what the CPU is going to be doing in the meantime while the user is playing that game is that it's actually generating the world, so it'll be doing that on a separate thread. So that will completely obfuscate the 5 to 8 seconds that it needs, because I'll have some sort of mini game that will be like a slot machine, something really quite flashy, really quite interesting, that allows the player to select their buffs. And I want to turn the buffs into like generally quite a big gameplay aspect, because it has to be important to the player. There has to be some consideration. So a game I played a little bit was like card games like Magic the Gathering. Before the game starts, there's often quite a lot of strategy in figuring out like, okay, which cards do I bring into my deck? You get a random hand and then you decide, do I swap them out? Do I do this or that? So I'd like to have something that involves quite a bit of that sort of tactic in this game, because if I can keep the player contemplating and interested for 5 to 8 seconds, then they can skip most of the arduous waiting time of the world gen. So that is a necessary evil. But I think if I can do that, then I will have avoided any of these problems in quite an interesting way. So Okay, so another bit relevant to the exploration is the actual exploration locations. So in this game, these places act a bit like levels. So the idea is that you get certain areas. You can say like, I would like to explore this certain area. And generally with the exploration locations, there's an expectation that there will be some sort of gameplay difference as a result of that. So it's kind of almost like a different world. So the ones I've got so far, the grasslands, the desert. So you can understand with the desert, there's less water, far more sand. And from a gameplay perspective, one of the things I've added is that in the sections of deep sand that appears in the desert, you'll often get certain enemy types. So for instance, like giant worms or something like that. That would be quite interesting and I think would help sell the feel of the desert. The other one I've got here so far is the Great Reservoir. It sounds kind of strange, but I had this idea. It's essentially the water levels rise and fall as the exploration progresses, which I think adds quite an interesting perspective on how things are actually played out because the water levels are just all over the place. And as well as that, I would like to be able to tie all of this stuff as much as possible into the lore itself. So the more I can do things like decide, this place and then have to justify it from a lore perspective, like I think that's going to be really, really fun. So I'm looking forward to figuring that out. So in the next section relating to gameplay, I talk quite a bit about item economics. So the economics of how the items actually fit together, which items are more valuable than others. You want to be very careful that there's balance because if the economics of a certain item outweigh another, then that means that certain items will just not be used because there's no purpose in using them. So from my perspective, I think you need to have a variety of items and I think you also need to make sure that everything sort of ties in and plays in with each other. Easier said than done, but it's written there. So obviously I'm trying to make an effort to solve it. Now, as this is a game about collecting items, you kind of have to think about what these items actually are. So a few things I've got: equipables, that's fairly obvious what that is, consumables and generic items, so that's things like potions and maybe some items that do specific functions relevant to the exploration. The EXP orbs, they're fairly straightforward, you just collect them. Money, again, you just collect. Charms, I will talk about later. And combat moves, so I think I put that there because the player can maybe like earn a combat move as a result of completing a quest or something like that. They are sort of an item within economy. They're not really items, but they probably do need to be in a list like this. So one of the things I would like to touch on is I think this game has to be as much as possible about the player's playstyle. So the player can play the game however they want because it's their time playing the game, right? So I'm thinking that really you have to base the character quite a bit around certain builds. And when I say builds, I mean a combination of buffs, charms, equipped items. The moves you have selected on your character at that time will determine how the game actually plays out. So things like, I don't want to limit the player in terms of what they can actually equip to their character because I think that will just allow me to make a far more interesting game. The player can do what they want. So it's things like, say the player wants to equip 2 shields and just go off and whack enemies with the shields. Maybe they have massive defense, rubbish attack as a result. But that could lead into some interesting play style, where they're using some other items. And, it's, players want to challenge themselves, like, can I defeat enemies using only passive items? That sort of thing. That really helps with the longevity of games. And not to mention that this is a procedural game, right? It's all randomly generated. So it's a sandbox to begin with. The player has full control over what they want to do with it. And I think me trying to lock it down to like, you have to have a sword in your hand in order to be able to do combat. That's just silly. I think you have to leave it up to the player and let them make dumb decisions and just generally see if they can break the game. That's the sort of thing I've always enjoyed doing. So I talk a bit in this section about all the different sort of how everything works. You might have items that shoot fireballs, a shield that causes little shields to spin around you, that sort of thing. I want it to be a little bit like the Binding of Isaac, where you can just get a variety of items and a lot of the time they all complement each other. I have a few systems here, including just generic consumables and that sort of thing. One of the things that's not really talked about much is charms and buffs. That's on TBD. That has a lot more to do with the fact that I haven't actually figured it out from a gameplay perspective, so it's not really in this document yet. I need to experiment with a few different ideas and just prototype them and see like how it works out and what happens. But my current idea for charms is something very similar to what you have in Hollow Knight. You essentially can equip these charms to your character, and the interesting thing about the charms is as much as they give you like improvements to your character, what they also allow you to do is you can combine certain charms, and it's things like you can use your sword faster, and you can also hit further. So if you combine those two charms, then suddenly you get a much stronger sword swing. And that is part of the benefit of that system. So you kind of need to think about how you're going to build stuff up. And say you equip a charm that makes swords more powerful, and then your character has a bow and arrow equipped, then obviously that makes no sense. So I think it's about player builds. The player can build their character however they want. I need to give them freedom in doing that. And I just want to build a nice system where everything is like moderately balanced and just makes sense. That would be fun, wouldn't it? So there's quite a few other things to talk about here, but one of the most obvious ones is story. Is currently still under TBD. Oh dear, how did that happen? So essentially the way I'm going about this game is I'm figuring out how it works from a gameplay perspective. From that perspective, as gameplay is king, I then want to go off and figure out all the other stuff based off just gameplay alone. So things like, I would like to justify my gameplay systems with some sort of lore. So say you have something like the Great Reservoir where the water goes up and down, I would want to be able to justify why it does that from a lore perspective. And then, once I have the lore, I can figure out how the story fits together. So do you see the sort of chicken and egg problem in that I need to get the gameplay figured out first before I can get that thing, before I can get that other thing. So they all depend on each other. So I do have quite a few ideas for the story, but I have yet to properly figure out some aspects of the game. I want to focus on gameplay more than anything at the moment. So I think in future I will focus more on necessarily how the story works. I have some basic quests and that sort of thing in my head, but I don't really want to think too much about those until the gameplay actually gets solidified. So yeah, stick around for that. I'm sure I'll get to it at some point because I do love stories. But the one thing I would like to talk about now, we have finally reached this point, is the monetization strategy. Ew. So let me just explain what my strategy is for this project and this channel really as a whole. So essentially the idea is that I wanted to make a game. I wanted to be able to build my reputation here on YouTube as someone who can deliver a sizable project. I want to be very consistent, very regimented in how I actually work through this. I want to give the impression that I know what I'm doing because I expect that after the 6 years or however long that I spent trying to figure out how to become a good game developer, that I can actually make my first commercial game and sell it and people will enjoy it. So to me, it's very important that I have a good reputation and people just generally like what I'm doing here. So I don't want to completely ram the game full of monetization because of course that would just completely tarnish my reputation. And I think I do genuinely love the craft. So I don't want to just make a garbage game for the sake of making a garbage game. The problem is that I did quit my job as a full-time software engineer to work on this project. So let's just say I'm not earning as much money as I used to be earning. I'm looking to build a long-term career from this where I can just keep making games, keep making things that people enjoy. And if I have a community here who likes not just the project that I'm working on at the moment, but like me as a character, then I'll be able to keep doing that. So with that in mind, let's talk through the monetization strategy for this game. The plan as listed in the document is essentially that for the Steam and PC release, it's just going to be flat fee. I don't know how much I'll charge for it, maybe $10. On the other hand though, the mobile version, due to the nature of the mobile marketplace, is probably going to have to take a bit of a different approach. The thing is that I think this is a game that's going to fit perfectly on mobile, like as a platform, considering it's there for 5-minute play sessions when you just got time to kill. I think it's a really, really good product for that sort of platform. But the thing is that the mobile platform doesn't really work like other platforms. The game will be free to download and I will include certain amounts of monetization in-game because I just can't see a way around that. I don't think I can charge a flat fee up front for it. It just wouldn't sell. What I've done is I've tried to balance this out as fairly as I think humanly possible. I did mention in my first video that I wasn't going to ram it full of loot boxes or anything like that. And I intend to stick to that because I said I would, so I'll stick to it. What I am going to add is there'll be adverts in between play sessions, but importantly you'll be able to just pay a flat fee and get rid of the ads altogether. So actually that's quite nice. And it'll be roughly the cost of what you'd expect to be paying for the game on Steam anyway. So as well as that though, I would like to investigate some other monetization options just to see what I can do without completely ruining the game. So two things I'm considering at the moment is when the buff system comes in, the pre-expiration buffs. I think it would be quite fun if I could just have some sort of other options where you can pay real money in order to get some better buffs to your character. Secondly, I think it would be interesting to investigate the system of revives when the player dies. I don't really know. I think there could be some other interesting gameplay aspect to that. Like I know in a game like Don't Starve, they had this interesting system where you could do this touchstone thing and then your character would get brought back to life, and there was always guaranteed to be one of those in the world at any point, so it's kind of like a bit of redundancy. But I think there's also the possibility for like a Legend of Zelda Fairy in the Bottle type approach, where you can just get items that will give you the option of reviving your character when you're dead. But one of the stipulations that I'll make about all of this is that any item that you can get through paying cash, you will also be able to get through regular gameplay. So it's things like if there is a Fairy in the Bottle type thing to revive the character, then you'll also be able to get those items through gameplay. Similarly, for the buff system, you should be able to get every single type of buff just regularly. Of course, some of that is dependent on luck, so we'll have to see. But you know, if players want to play, then they'll be able to get the better items. Like, I won't paywall anything. I don't really want to do that. I really want to avoid trying to paywall things as much as possible. Like, the thing is, I don't necessarily want to rule any of this stuff out, but I think I'm really going to try and make more of an effort with the community to make sure that people are on the same page about, you know, whether that's acceptable or not. And to be perfectly honest, in terms of my monetization strategy for this as a career, I'd much rather be making the money through something like Patreon, where people are just voluntarily giving me money, compared to me necessarily having to ruin the game. Well, ruin, you know, some people might like it, some might not. Going forwards, I'll probably be making more single player games anyway, rather than necessarily just keep making mobile games. So I think it makes more sense if I can try and build up a system where I can make income through something like Patreon or Google AdSense or whatever. But I'll definitely need more than the Google AdSense money I'm making at the moment in order to survive, but that's another topic for another day. Finally, I go into a bit of detail about the timeline for what I expect for the rest of this year. We're halfway through September at the moment, and that's gone very quick. So I really do need to get down and start to think about some of these other functions and how they work. So I'll just quickly read out some of the ideas that I've written down of what I generally think the plan would be. So the Make the World Invisible section, I need to figure that out from a gameplay perspective. It's probably going to be a complex one from a technical perspective as well as a gameplay perspective. So that might end up taking the rest of September. The other thing is like experiment with items to distract the player. I think there's all sorts of potential for that, and they probably won't be too hard to actually implement. But again, whether they get done in September is another thing. October, I've generally just thought, so it's things like the charms and the buff system. From a gameplay perspective, I think it's fairly straightforward. I think it's quite a well understood concept. It's just that I need to make sure that the economics of how it all fits together works fine. But if I have a whole month to do that, then I think it should be fine. The slot machine minigame is another thing. I don't actually know how the minigame is going to work, and I say slot machine, it's more just like slot machine in spirit. It's really going to be whatever seems like fun to me. And one thing I do mention is try and integrate more of the lore. One thing I'll mention, I do have some ideas for what to name this game, and I'd like to start to talk more about that at some point in future. I think I need to start to consolidate this stuff early on before the betas actually start rolling out. The game's kind of going to reach an interesting perspective where I start releasing the alpha builds of the game, and hopefully people play and see what they think. If they think good things, then we'll just go from there. I think the plan for next year, I think I'm just going to have to wait and see. But I know that for the end of this year, I essentially just need to make as complete a product as I possibly can, and just take away a lot of the alpha aspects of the game that exist at the moment, because it's quite clearly not even a tech demo at this point. So there's a lot to do. I think for November and December, I've been fairly sort of underscript about what I actually want to do. It's things like technical stabilization, yeah, that makes sense. Just polish stuff up, get it looking interesting. What I can say is the plan for the new year is that hopefully I'll have a hopefully well understood technical and gameplay base in order to base everything else off of. So then I can actually start to add content, and you know, it's when the content starts to come in that it really ramps up. I think the early alpha builds are just going to be me showing it to friends and family, and you know, the more kind of eager members of the community, and just seeing that they actually think it works from a gameplay perspective. That's the important bit. As long as the gameplay is there, then I can start to add content, scale it up, and should be exciting. Yeah, and then I basically credit myself down the bottom, so that's exciting. And I also credit you, the viewer. So, thanks for watching my video, boys. yeah, again, comments down below. I know it's been a bit of a weird one this week. Regardless, this game design doc is currently being hosted on my website, which I will link in a comment down below this video. So you'll be able to go off and have a peruse of this document yourself if you feel like it. So thank you for watching this video. Next week I'm going to get back to writing some actual code. I now have a plan of what I'm going to do going forward. It's very exhilarating. See ya.